Good morning to the Caron YouTube audience, and again, good morning to all of you who are here. I want to begin with a story I've told here before. So I apologize if there are those who will remember the repetition. It's the right story for this morning. It was mid to late August of 2017, and my brother Stephen, 23 months older than me, had been sober something like 14 years, but was in a tragic motorcycle accident and ended up in critical care ICU. Major brain injury, tons of orthopedic injuries. Pretty obviously near the end of his life. And I'd spent a good deal of time there at this hospital, which was not, because he was at the nearest trauma hospital to the motorcycle accident, not a hospital that any of us knew. But an amazing facility for which I'm so grateful for the care that he and we received there. And there was a particular day that I want to focus in on, and something that happened to me, which here it is so many years later, I vividly remember, and yet will have a difficulty bringing into the room today because it was so much more than words. So on this particular day, we had planned to gather family members together, and the intention was to make the decision to remove the breathing tube. And we weren't sure if he would die immediately, but we were pretty sure that would be the path to the end of his life. And the emotional intensity was high. My wife Judy was there. Steve's wife Evelyn was there. The two kids, my nephew and niece were there, and grown adult children, big single occupancy room. And I was talking to this nurse that came to me yesterday. Her name was Allison. Oh my gosh, what a saint she had been for us. Critical care nurse. She'd actually come in on her day off to be with us for this difficult decision. And the way Steve had been basically non-responsive had been so hard for us. But there had been moments that others in the family had borne witness to, and I was feeling a little left out. And then Judy, I don't know if she tapped me on the elbow or whatever, but she got my attention. She said, "Jack, his eyes." And Steve's eyes were just a tiny bit open, which they hadn't been. And I'm an eye contact person. I wasn't always, but I've learned in my recovery that this is a thing for me, and as a chaplain, I pay attention to those of you who are patients. And if you're eye avoidant, it tells me something. And if you're able to meet a gaze, it tells me something else. So this moment unfolds. I find myself kneeling at the side of this ICU bed, trying to stare up into Steve's eyes because his head is a tiny bit downcast. He'd been in one of those neck cradles, but they had taken it off, they had combed his hair, they had tried to clean him up because they knew this was a pivotal day for us, but he still was on the ventilator. And I'm looking for what you and I have. It's happening right this moment. I call it the ICU seeing ECU moment. It's an astonishing thing that we can do this in an auditorium. Is I can hop around to the crowd, and there's something that tells me that you see me seeing you. And this is what I want. I want to see him seeing me, see him. And I start to say the things that I've already said, but since his eyes are open, as a prayer, that maybe it's the right time to say again, I love you, and you're amazing, and I'll miss you. Your kids are amazing, all the things. And it would not be until later, when I was actually back here at Caron, Jackie, where are you? Anyway, this place will make you cry if nothing else, right? So I'm working with a friend of mine who has had, I guess, they weren't twins, but had two kids in rapid succession. And she's showing me the pictures of her children. Some of you know, I won't out her, but anyway, one of our colleagues, who most of us just dearly love this woman, and she's making babies these days, which is great. But I see this picture of her two children who are about 2 years apart, and they're tiny. And all of a sudden, something happens to me, and I realize that what had happened on that day in that hospital room, I was going to call it hotel room, in my quest to connect with Steve, was that I had wanted the adult me to find the adult him. But in seeing the photograph, it struck me. His and my stories were complicated. There were years where we barely spoke. And then when I got sober and I tried to make my amends, he was like, he dismissed and minimized and all that stuff, and we had some stuff to deal with together. And then when he got sober, he called me and he said, Jack, I need to sit down with you. And I was like, okay, kind of sense what might be coming. And we sat down together and he was like, I am so sorry. You tried to make your amends to me and I completely blew you off. But can we try this again? So that changed our lives, right? All of a sudden, so this is the adult Jack finding an adult sibling and developing an adult relationship with him that I understood was the relationship I had with him. But I had some part of me didn't even have any awareness that when I was pre-verbal and basically pre-cognitive, unable to articulate, you know how infants are, they're like, and we desperately want to know what the infant is thinking, but the truth is they're not, right? They're just being, they're just experiencing, they're just suffering. And when I was a crib occupant, my brother Steve must have seemed like an elephant to me, right? He was the nearest in age and proximity to me, and he was probably as important in some ways as any of the huge adult figures I didn't even understand. He was probably my first teacher and my shepherd and guide, and because I had had something hit me when I had been on my knees looking up into his eyes that was really more than I know how to put words to. And until I saw this photograph of these infants, it came to me that the closest I can be to putting words to it is to say that when I went looking for him with my cognitive function, he found me as the pre-cognitive, no longer verbal entity that still was in there. I felt seen and known in some way that didn't involve rapid eye, like eye tracking or anything like that. I felt like in the wells of his fairly dilated pupils, I found me in a way that ever since then, when I listen to music, I think of music as painting the back of my mind in that way that is beyond words or whatever. And I don't know quite how to make the jump from that very deep story, but there's a deep connection I want to make between that story and the theme for today's chapel, which is, the phrase for it is recovery of soul. And we use this expression in the common language of lost souls. And I think often we mean that of people in our families who wander off, like many of us. Don't raise your hands. But I don't mean it in just that way. What I mean by recovery of soul is something that I first want to pair to the phenomenon of substance use disorder. And there are people in the room who are very schooled in this field and who will know the name of a woman named Nora Volkow, who is still, I think, functioning as the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. That's a terrible name, by the way, for that organization. They should rename it. Because it's an outdated conception of what's going on here. But Nora Volkow owns her place in the field of neuroscience and addiction medicine because of studies that she did of people with cocaine addiction and as they moved into cocaine abstinence, cocaine use disorder and abstinence from it. where what she began to demonstrate is something that now is believed to be a general truth, which is that the phenomenon of addiction, her phrase for it, to make it non-technical, is that it's become very complex. To talk about addiction as an issue of a hijacked brain. And this idea of your brain being captive may or may not feel illuminating, but I think it's tremendously, it rings true to me, because I know as my own use disorder started to run the show, it's as if my cognitive mind was a spectator. And I watched myself get the bottle off the fridge and pour the drink. And there was some part of me that was going, don't do it, danger, Will Robinson. And yet I could not prevent the enactment of the participation ritual, I'll call it. And it's the ritual brain, it's the primal fight, flight, freeze brain, it's the mammalian yearning, love, attachment, longing, warm, fuzzy, tribal parts of our brain. We are taught that the primal stem of the brain is reptilian, and that the midbrain is mammalian, and that the thing that distinguishes, how wonderful human beings are, we're so much better than everything and everyone else because we have this front lobe. It's some negative trouble. And I think the pride and arrogance that we bring against other species perhaps is unwarranted. We're making a mess of this place, but the point that Dr. Volkow makes is that addiction fractures the harmonious interplay between those more primal aspects of our being and the thinker. And I believe her. And her claim is that you can see it on the scans, and I find the scans very interesting. The Steve story is about hitting at a much lower level. Psychology, behavioral health, and indeed anthropology and cultural studies and sociology and all that sort of stuff would tell us that addiction is not merely a neurochemical thing, but that it is an attachment issue. This is one of the leading frames of reference for the behavioral health field in terms of interpreting a use disorder, is that what gets dysregulated is our attachment chemistry. And it's not that we no longer attach, it's that we maladaptively attach. So we're like, and none of you do that in relationships, right? But we have this the clingy, needy, yearning, tribal part of us. Often because of wounds, this is a known truth that many people who suffer from use disorders have these adverse childhood experiences or trauma, or these things that are precursor injuries, soul injuries they've become called. Fascinating on my topic. Soul injuries are often present in people who develop use disorders. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I guarantee you there's probably most of this room is thinking about something in your story. A time when Johnny Walker suddenly presented as a safer opportunity than love. And I was trained in pastoral care, clinical theology, clinical practical theology. It was a neat attempt to bridge very high-minded stuff with very real sick and suffering people in hospitals and rehabs and military battlefields. And one of the principal teachers in this domain was a guy in the 1920s named Anton Boysen, who developed this phrase, recovery of soul, as a way of talking about the responsibility of the chaplain. And the way he talks about it and writes about it, I always think of, there's an old AA story about a person who's in a hole, and people walk by and give advice and instruction, but the person can't find their way out. And then somebody walks along and jumps in the hole with them. And the person in the hole is like, dude, that was stupid, we can't get out of here. And the person who jumps in the hole says, no, I know how to get out. And they're like, well, I haven't figured out. It's like, put your back against mine, and they walk up the wall together. This is the chaplain's task, is to jump in the hole. So, it is my question for you. In what way have you lost connection with the deepest part of you? Or why are you here? And who is it that you love, who you see having lost that ability to present themselves to you, the deepest part of themselves? Because families get lost when their loved ones get lost in this phenomenon of disconnection. And a question to finish is, I told you that when I went to go find Steve, I was looking for a way that Steve was going to present himself to me. And if that was the only thing I was open to receiving in that moment, I would have told you I was disappointed. But in fact, I received something from him that I didn't even think he could give me, which was to be present to me in a way that I, for a moment, had forgotten. Is my jam, how I. What about you? Have you come here with some upper mind thing about what this is about, or did you come because you need to understand addiction? That's not hard, by the way. What if you're here on Magic Mountain to be found? Have somebody see you, love you until you can love yourself. That's the old phrase that has lived on this mountain. Please let us love you until you can love yourself.